Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a stack of high-level source material, and we're focusing on a challenge that sits, well, right at the intersection of economics and geopolitics.
It really does.
Our topic is the future of the U.S. macroeconomy under a potential second Trump administration, a policy vision that, often gets boiled down to Trumponomics.
And this is not just some academic exercise. Our sources, which, they provide these incredible detailed models and strategic forecasts, are grappling with a really fundamental question.
Which is?
Will the U.S. economy collapse under the weight of these pretty radical policies? Or, and this is the counterintuitive part, could it actually see an aggressive boom and thrive by 2026?
Okay, so let's unpack that and set the mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We have four distinct, highly detailed global scenarios laid out, and they don't just analyze the U.S., but also the resulting dynamics in China and Europe.
Right, the ripple effects.
Exactly. So our goal is to give you, the listener, the definitive shortcut to understanding these diverging paths. We want you to walk away knowing why the economic choices made in Washington are going to cause massive ripples across global trade and, political stability.
I think it's vital to frame the context correctly here. The macroeconomic approach we're analyzing it's inherently radical. It's defined by these aggressive blanket tariffs, for one, significant deregulation designed to boost domestic supply, and then maybe the most destabilizing element of all, this open questioning of the Federal Reserve's political independence.
That sets the stage for enormous volatility. So we need to start with the immediate flashpoints. If these policies are enacted, where does the economic friction begin? What are the core policies that really define the foundation of this Trumponomics?
Well, the most immediate pressure points are twofold: trade and central bank autonomy. On trade, the aggressive use of tariffs is designed to force manufacturing back onto American soil. But the cost, as we saw in the previous administration's actions, is often this immediate economic shock.
That shock being a loss of purchasing power for American consumers, which the sources note was already politically visible in swing states like New Jersey, Virginia during recent elections.
Exactly. Consumers feel that pinch almost immediately. Now, the administration is attempting to mitigate this political pain by offering new tariff exemptions.
A strategic move.
It is, yeah. A way to keep some supply lines flowing and maybe dampen some of that voter anger. But the core economic threat, that remains.
The core threat being the classic fear of stagflation, right?
Yep.
Higher prices combined with constrained supply. But hold on, if these tariffs are supposed to help domestic production, why does the analysis jump straight to stagflation?
It's because of how the tariffs are initially absorbed. The stagflation fear really stems from this assumption that foreign producers don't fully absorb the costs.
They pass them on.
They pass them on to the U.S. importer. And if the domestic U.S. supply side can't respond fast enough, and that takes years, new factories, labor training, you just get higher costs without enough new domestic product to balance the market.
And that's constrained supply.
That is the definition of constrained supply.
Is there any early data suggesting whether this is actually happening?
The sources offer a pretty nuanced look at the short term. They indicate that in September 2025, the prices for manufactured goods imported by the U.S., and this is measured before tariffs were even calculated, had only increased slightly year on year, about 0.8%.
So not a huge jump.
Not huge, no. It suggests foreign producers are trying to maintain access to the U.S. market by, eating some of that cost. But the ingredients for a wider inflationary impact from the tariffs themselves are definitely there.
Okay, we've addressed trade. Now let's talk about the Federal Reserve. This is arguably the biggest long-term stability risk.
I would agree with that. It affects the entire U.S. fiscal path.
So what's the play here?
What's fascinating is the administration's stated desire for a flexible successor to Jay Powell. The goal is explicitly lower short-term interest rates.
To juice the economy.
To juice the economy and, just as important, reduce borrowing costs for the government. But the sources are pretty clear. This push, if it's successful, could backfire very, very quickly.
Okay, how does that work? How do lower short-term rates trigger higher long-term rates? That just sounds counterintuitive.
Because the market prices risk. If investors perceive that the Fed is losing its independence, that it's being influenced by political goals to keep rates artificially low,
They expect inflation.
they expect future inflation. And to protect themselves, they demand a higher risk premium to hold long-term U.S. Treasury debt. This is exactly why the Fed itself is acting as such a crucial stabilizing factor right now.
So the Fed is essentially resisting the political pressure. It's acting as a dissident, like you said, to protect the value of the dollar and fight that surge in anticipated inflation.
Yeah, precisely. Their reluctance to rapidly lower rates below 3% is the key bulwark. But this resistance, it has a really painful domestic cost.
How so?
Well, by demanding higher long-term rates, what the market sees as a safer, non-inflationary rate, they're effectively forcing households and businesses to borrow at higher costs. It's particularly harmful for home buyers, anyone planning long-term financing.
So it's stability, but at the cost of immediate pain for a lot of people.
That's the trade-off.
And we can't overlook the structural constraint you flagged earlier. Labor supply, stricter immigration policies, potentially millions fewer foreign-born workers. That means the pressure on wages won't ease up.
It's a foundational issue. A reduced labor supply impacts everything from agriculture to service industries to entry-level manufacturing. Wages have to rise to attract a smaller pool of workers, and that puts continuous upward pressure on inflation.
So that labor constraint, combined with the tariff-driven price hikes, is what makes that short-term stagflation risk so acute.
It's the perfect storm for it.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. It's clear the road ahead is volatile. Now let's pivot from the policy foundation to the actual projected outcomes. We have 4 paths. Let's look at the first 2. This painful return to orthodoxy versus the radical domestic boom.
Right, let's start with scenario 1. Orthodoxy ultimately prevails. This is really the base case scenario, where the initial radical phase just proves to be unsustainable.
And it gives way to normalization.
It gives way to normalization, exactly.
So the system bends, but it doesn't break. How does that normalization actually happen?
It's forced by the market and the Fed's resistance. Because the Fed acts as that powerful dissident, like we said, resisting rapid rate cuts, it prevents uncontrolled inflation. The sources model a moderate inflation rebound in September 2025, hitting a 3.7% annualized rate.
So it's high, but it's not runaway inflation.
Exactly. This scenario suggests that core policy orthodoxy, backed by that institutional resistance, it ultimately returns.
It sounds like a painful, but I guess necessary course correction. We avoid disaster, but we still have to grit our teeth through a slow, painful landing point, and consumers are left with those higher borrowing costs for years.
That's the trade-off. It's surviving, not thriving.
Okay.
Now let's turn to the genuinely optimistic vision, scenario 2. The success of the MAGG economy. This is the outcome where the collapse is avoided entirely and the U.S. sees a sustained domestic surge.
This vision has to be predicated on avoiding stagflation, or at least making it extremely brief. What's the fundamental mechanism that breaks the gravity of those tariff and labor constraints we talked about?
It all hinges on a massive, almost miraculous surge in productivity. And we're not just talking incremental growth, we're talking about accelerated technological innovation, particularly in AI, acting as an economic turbocharger.
So the idea is that this boom means consumption can stay high without creating lasting inflationary pressures.
Because new technologies are increasing output faster than demand is increasing prices, if that makes sense.
It does. But innovation is always happening. What specifically catalyzes this success under these policies?
Well, deregulation is a huge part of it, clearing bureaucratic hurdles for energy and tech. But the true game changer in this scenario is foreign investment. I mean, we are talking about strategic allies placing enormous bets on the U.S.
How big?
The sources highlight a specific investment pledge, an astonishing $550 billion to $600 billion from Japan and European governments and companies by 2028.
Wow, $600 billion. That changes the whole dynamic immediately. And where is this capital flowing?
It's targeted directly at strategic U.S. sectors. Semiconductors, rare earth processing, high-tech manufacturing. The logic is defensive.
Defensive.
Yeah, if the U.S. is going protectionist, allies have to build their supply chains inside the U.S. to maintain access to the American market. It creates this massive, virtuous cycle of investment that leads to technological dominance.
That model of success is compelling. But even this optimistic scenario has to be tempered by those severe structural limitations we discussed. I mean, if $600 billion pours in, what are the biggest obstacles that could still derail this mega boom?
3 major internal friction points. First, the lack of skilled labor. It is a severe, chronic supply-side constraint. And there's a powerful but pretty sobering data point here.
Okay.
The U.S. secondary education PISA scores, which measure how proficient 15-year-olds are in math, reading, and science, internationally ranked the U.S. 46th in the world in 2022.
46th. That's That's shockingly low for a country aiming for technological dominance.
It is. That systemic shortage of educated and technically skilled labor, combined with restrictive immigration policies, means that even if you build the factory, you simply can't find the trained engineers and high-level technicians to run it. It's an immediate bottleneck.
And the high-tech boom itself creates a second problem, almost a self-inflicted one: energy supply.
Absolutely. The massive investment in AI and semiconductors requires an enormous amount of electricity. We face significant supply constraints in energy production, driven by this rapidly rising demand from new data centers.
So if you can't expand power generation fast enough,
it acts as a literal handbrake on the entire technological productivity surge. It's a classic supply-side failure.
We've established the domestic U.S. dynamics. Now, let's zoom out, because whatever path the U.S. takes, orthodoxy or boom, the global ripple effects are profound.
Yeah.
Let's look first at how China reacts to these aggressive U.S. tariffs.
So China is forced into a fundamental pivot. They have to shift dramatically away from reliance on shrinking external demand toward a model focused purely on domestic consumption and productivity. They call it their quality strategy.
But this pivot is incredibly difficult.
It's very difficult. And the difficulty really centers on the risk of deflation, which they are already grappling with.
Right.
China is struggling with this pervasive deflation risk because of massive overcapacity, which is fueled by what's called financial repression. The government keeps capital costs artificially low for state-owned industries.
So they just produce too much stuff.
Way more than the global market or their own consumers can absorb. And compounding this is high household savings, which acts as a drag on consumption.
And when you have deflation, when prices continually fall, why is that so dangerous for an economy?
Because deflation increases the real value of accumulated debt. If your income stays flat or shrinks while prices are falling, your debt burden just becomes heavier in real terms. It makes it incredibly difficult for Chinese authorities to encourage consumers to draw down those savings and start spending.
A very tricky balancing act.
It is.
Now, if we return to that successful Meiji path, scenario 2, the sources suggest that model is actually exported to Europe. That sounds painful for Europe, but you suggested there could be a paradoxical benefit.
It is painful, but it's ultimately constructive. If U.S. growth is strong and aggressively protectionist, European trading partners are likely forced to imitate the U.S. They adopt their own protectionist measures, they focus internally.
And how does that help them?
It forces the EU to implement structural reforms and consolidation. Those protectionist measures might actually boost European competitiveness and strengthen their export position relative to the U.S. by reducing their reliance on vulnerable global supply chains. The U.S. volatility becomes a painful catalyst for European unity.
But conversely, Europe and Japan are described as the natural victims of the radical phase of U.S. policy. Why are they particularly vulnerable in the short term?
Simply put, they are heavily export-oriented economies. They run chronic current account deficits. That means they rely heavily on selling their goods to the rest of the world, particularly the U.S., to balance their books.
So when the U.S. slams the door shut with high tariffs,
they bear the brunt of the instability.
And what's the measurable impact? Is there a number on that?
The sources estimate the direct impact of U.S. tariffs on the GDP of Japan and the Eurozone to be around 0.5 percentage points. That's a significant hit for economies that are already struggling with low growth.
And their relationship with the U.S., particularly Europe's, has this critical energy dependency that makes them weaker negotiators, doesn't it?
That's a major vulnerability that's cited. Europe's dependence on American liquefied natural gas, which they need for energy security, just places them in a weaker bargaining position when U.S. policy becomes so radical and unpredictable.
Okay, let's look at the extreme scenarios now. First, the worst case for the U.S. scenario 3, China's victory. What defines Beijing's success in this economic contest?
This scenario is defined by China successfully leveraging its current supply chain dominance to slow down the American industrial revival. And the core tool here is rare earths.
Right, the minerals essential for tech.
Exactly. China maintains control over access to processed rare earths, forcing the U.S. to divert massive amounts of capital and time into building out its own refining capabilities. That diversion just stalls the high-tech boom of scenario 2.
So instead of a manufacturing revival, the U.S. spends critical years just playing catch-up on basic mineral processing.
Precisely. And China doesn't just rely on raw materials. Beijing could also deploy what the sources call regulatory tariffs, technical barriers, quality standards, environmental rules that act as non-tariff obstacles to curb American industrial revival.
And if China wins this economic contest, what happens to Europe and the global economy?
A Chinese victory would severely penalize Europe. The uncertainty would lead to a weak euro exchange rate. And globally, this outcome maintains the risk of pervasive deflation, because if U.S. industrial policy fails, global money supply strategies are unlikely to venture into unconventional territory to stimulate deep growth.
It results in a world of continued friction where the U.S. just fails to reverse its industrial decline.
That's the outcome.
Okay, finally, let's consider the most ambitious counterbalance. Scenario 4, the European awakening. This posits Europe seizing the moment to become a global economic power player.
It's the boldest vision, for sure. It requires extraordinary political will. It hinges on implementing a clear, comprehensive plan, the kind of reforms described in the Draghi report, which advocates for deeper integration and strategic collective investment.
So Europe uses the U.S. cause volatility as a springboard.
Exactly. They leverage existing programs like the massive Next Generation EU recovery plan and mobilize strategic investments in critical areas like green energy and defense. But the real game changer is political. This requires genuine consolidation and true fiscal flexibility across the bloc.
And that flexibility hinges specifically on Germany, doesn't it?
It does. The sources highlight that this scenario requires Germany to implement an unusual national budgetary policy that typically means suspending or bypassing their constitutional debt brake to facilitate the necessary investment across the Eurozone.
So without German financial flexibility, the European awakening just can't happen.
It's a non-starter.
If that complex political reform is achieved, what's the ultimate outcome for Europe?
Europe successfully transforms into a genuine economic bloc and a global safe haven. Its political stability and predictable regulatory environment attract significant foreign capital away from the volatility of the U.S.
A powerful economic rebuke to the American populist experiment.
It would be, yes, demonstrating that stability and deep integration can successfully drive long-term growth.
This has been a deep dive into 4 truly distinct possibilities. I mean, we're ranging from a return to painful orthodoxy, a rapid domestic boom enabled by foreign capital, the dominance of a rival like China, or this regional consolidation in Europe. The core tension is perfectly clear. U.S. policy sets the stage, creating 4 plausible paths forward.
And we want to leave you with the context that these paths fundamentally hinge on a few critical near-term decisions. First, the resilience of the Federal Reserve's independence. Second, the administration's policy on U.S. labor supply. And third, whether major global players like China and Europe choose strategic conflict or cooperation. Those 3 variables are the difference between a controlled deceleration, a domestic boom, or, global instability.
Which brings us back to the limitations we discussed in the optimistic scenario. We noted that the severe structural limitation to the successful MAGI boom was the lack of skilled labor, highlighted by those incredibly low U.S. PISA scores ranked 46th globally. It raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over. If long-term constraints on U.S. skilled labor and education are that severe, can productivity-driven success truly be achieved solely through technological investment and deregulation? Or, regardless of which political leadership is in charge, does the U.S. require far broader structural reform in education, infrastructure, and immigration to win the long game and avoid stagnation? Something to think about.
Indeed. We've given you the tools to analyze the road ahead.
That's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.